Hey there drone fans, Rick here again from Drone Valley. In today's video, I'd like to discuss the latest firmware update for the DJI Mini 3 Pro drone, and I'll give you a few reasons why you may want to skip this one. The version I'm talking about is V01-00-0300, and if you've booted up your DJI RC recently, you've probably been prompted to download that firmware and update the drone, the controller, and even the DJI Fly app. Now what's interesting is it doesn't affect the RCN1 controller, only the integrated controller. So that was our first clue that something interesting was going on. Now to be fair, we get beta firmware pretty well in advance of things being released to the public, and we test it, we go out in the field to make sure all the things that DJI says this new firmware will do actually work on the drone. We look for other things that happen in the drone that maybe we weren't expecting. And honestly, we tested this firmware and it was rock solid. It did everything they said it was supposed to do as far as we could test it. It was only later when we were working on a couple of other projects that we noticed some things in the firmware that changed. And again, they're not major things, but they're weird things. And I thought I'd bring them to your attention because anytime new firmware comes out, it's sort of a balancing act over what features are in there and do I need those features? And if I update it, am I going to break something that's already working? So we're constantly in that pivot between, do I rush into new firmware or do I wait and see if things are reported around it? And the basic question I look at anytime new firmware comes out is, why is the firmware being released? And the place you find that's in the release notes. So if you read through the release notes, it'll tell you exactly what this new firmware is designed to fix. Now in this case, .0300 was designed to fix two things, or to implement two things. The first one has to do with the Japanese remote ID, which actually took place June 20th. Now, interestingly, this firmware was released on the 16th, so I think there may be a bit of a rush to get the firmware out so they could be in compliance for the Japanese remote ID. Now, that remote ID, as far as I can tell, is similar to the US in the sense that the drone has to broadcast identification information, and I think it's geospatial positioning, its heading, and all the things we have to broadcast from the US from the drone. Now, that firmware update allows the Japanese market to build those features, the remote ID identification tag, or build that ID tag into their software so the drone can broadcast that, I'm assuming over Wi-Fi. And that's great. So Japanese have that covered. In the States, we don't have to worry about that for a year yet, at least. And it's nice to know that the Mini 3 is probably going to be compliant in the States once that becomes mandatory in the field. So you're buying a product that, again, through firmware, they're constantly upgrading it and updating the product. So that's a good thing. But I'm thinking to myself, I don't have to worry about remote ID right now, so that's not a feature that I'm rushing to put into the drone. So based on that alone, I'm thinking, man, maybe I'll wait. Then the second thing they implemented, which I think is a good thing, is they've got a new low power mode for quick transfer because, to be fair, the drone gets hot. It doesn't get, demonstrably hot where you can't touch it, but it gets warm. And that's not a shock because it's doing so many things. It's got 4K resolution. It's got to encode, that video, put it into processing, move it to an SD card. It's got geospatial awareness. It's got crash avoidance built in. It's got gimbal movements. There's a lot of mechanics, a lot of electronics going on in there that are all drinking electrons from the battery, and they're sweating because they're doing work. So it gets really warm. We had the problem with the Hubsan where it got really, really hot. Well, this one gets hot too. So if you're out in a really hot day, I was out the other day, it was almost 100 degrees. I left it on the mat, I turned it on, and I got busy with something else before I actually took off to fly, and I got an overtemp warning. So I think what DJI is realizing is it does get warm, and how do we fix that? We don't want to have overtemp warnings. So when you're doing things like quick transfer, they're shutting down everything else you don't need to move those files from the drone to your phone. So they're probably turning off things like GPS, they're turning off gimbal control, they're turning off video processing. All the things you don't really need are being shut off, which means the drone's going to sweat less, and that's a good thing. So I thought, okay, the quick transfer thing is nice because if it takes me 10 minutes to transfer all the files to my phone, all the drone's doing basically is heating up. So I thought, okay, that's definitely a feature that I want to have in there. Now what's interesting is we thought a little bit more about it, and what we're working on a lot of projects behind the scenes here. One of them that I'm really looking forward to is an audio kit for this DJI RC controller where you can actually record audio over the video. We've had a lot of people asking about it. We came out with a kit for the smart controllers that does a great job of doing that. We actually have a new wireless kit coming as well, but we're working hard for the last couple of weeks on coming up with a kit that would work with this brand new controller. We had it working fine. And literally the day before I started talking about it on the channel and offering on the website, we did the firmware update, and it broke stuff. It broke a lot of things. And I thought, well, that's interesting. Why would firmware break something? Well, the truth is, I've been involved in both hardware, software development, and marketing my entire career. 40 years I've been in the business, and I'm a software engineer as well as a hardware engineer. So I've spent a lot of time developing code, building code. And a lot of times what will happen is when you change things in the code, There are unintended consequences. You may break things. We call them artifacts, where if you change something, something weird happens over here, and you've got to notice that so you can fix that code. Well, I think that's what happened here. So how it manifests itself in the product, and you can see this if you do the update, and these may seem like small things, but to me they're big things. The first thing you'll notice is that when you do a screen capture of video on it, they change the resolution. Used to be 720, now it's 960. It's some weird resolution as far as screen captures go, and I thought, well, that's strange. Why would you change that? And then they changed the frame rate, so it's a lower frame rate. So you're getting, I guess you're getting a higher resolution image, but a lower frame rate. But why would you change that? Like, there's nothing in the firmware update notes that say we're going to change the resolution of the screen capture. The other thing they did, which is what shut the project down, is that when you screen capture now, they hobble the USB-C port. Whereas before, the USB-C port was open, and it's still hobbled anyway because it's a custom version of Android that they're running on there. And I know they do that for a specific reason, and I've got a whole clip explaining that. But that custom version of Android shuts down a lot of the drivers needed to do magical things on that USB-C port. Because the first thing I wanted to test was, can I push video out through the USB-C port through an adapter? You can't. They shut that down. Well, they shut down external microphone connection to the USB-C port coming in. Now, I don't think they did it on purpose. I think, again, it's an artifact of changing the firmware. So they, again, we're sitting down thinking, well, why would they do that? Why are they even messing with screen capture? And why'd they mess with the USB-C port? Well, if you think about it, this unit has a USB-C port that's labeled host right there, which is an active port. It's also got a regular USB-C port here, which is basically, this is an accessory to something plugged in to a host. This acts as a host to other accessories externally. Well, why would they build that in there? I imagine they've got accessories coming. Now, we all know that they're coming out with a dongle for other regions that gives you cellular connectivity. I think it's available in Europe. It's probably going to be available in Japan as well. It isn't available in the States for all kinds of regulatory reasons, but wouldn't it be cool if they came out with a dongle that would plug into the USB-C port, probably mount on the back here. You could slide a SIM card in it and get cellular connection on this controller when you're out in the field to download your maps and do all kinds of things like live streaming and all the rest of it. So I'm wondering if with this DJI update for the Japanese market for remote ID, whether they kind of messed around with that USB-C port to make it compatible with some kind of external dongle and inadvertently broke it, which most users wouldn't notice. You wouldn't actually know that they changed anything, but being a development team, we notice stuff like that, and it drives us crazy. So that's the first thing they broke there. In addition to that, the low power mode I think is great, but one other thing we noticed is when you do the update, when you first boot up the drone and take off, it, as a default, shuts off your Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. Why would you do that? Well, again, we're trying to get as little energy heating up the box as possible. So let's shut off Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, because those are things most people don't use unless they're going to be live streaming or they're tethering to a phone, and you can turn it back on. So just know that when you do the update, it's going to turn off Wi-Fi and Bluetooth when you take off. If you're trying to tether to a phone to download maps, you've got to turn it back on again. Like, all these things make sense in the background, but as a user, none of that's in the release notes. Now, I really think it should be in the release notes that, hey, if you do the update, this new version is going to turn off Wi-Fi, it's going to turn off Bluetooth. We're messing around with the USB-C port, so if you bought one of Rick's audio kits, it may not work on this new firmware. So all those things being equal, lead me to believe that the little benefit you're going to get out of the quick transfer for now, I don't think outweighs the things they broke in the firmware. I would say wait on this one, because the 0300 seems like a release that was specifically designed to help the Japanese market accommodate those remote ID requirements, which again happened on June 20th. This firmware came out on the 16th. So I can imagine a bunch of engineers, scientists, and guys in software rushing through coding to make sure that that's enabled so they could meet that requirement and they could sell the drone in Japan. I'm sure a lot of glass got broken when they were developing that. And these artifacts that we're uncovering, I think, are results of that. I don't want to say rush programming, but maybe not as QC in the background. And again, it takes guys like us to notice that. So from a user perspective, I think if you're on 0150, which is the version I'm on right now, really stable version, does a phenomenal job at the drone. It implements all the features you care about, all the wonderful things that weren't quite there at release, but they built into that firmware. Stick with 0150. When the 350 comes out, we'll test it. The 400 comes out, we'll test it. Hopefully in the next generation, they'll realize, oh my gosh, we got some issues in the firmware. We got to clean those up. And the next generation, whether it's 0350 or 0400, we'll have all that stuff fixed. And we'll put a clip together and talk about it. Because the thing I love overall, and I know I'm going on long here, but when you buy a product like this, the hardware is frozen. So the hardware engineers built it, they shipped it, and it's done. But the software is never done. The software is an evolving landscape where engineers are looking at it every day and modifying code and thinking, what else can we do with that drone? Let's build it into the firmware. So this constant stream of release of firmware is a really good thing because it enhances a product that you paid a fixed dollar amount for that can now do magical things it couldn't do when you bought it. So I think it's great that we do these firmware updates, but let's be a little cautious. And my recommendation at the end of the day is always, don't jump on it the minute you see it. Wait a couple of weeks, watch the forums, watch our channel, talk to other pilots and say, hey, did you do the update to the 0300? Yeah, I did it a couple of weeks ago. Did you notice anything weird? Well, yeah, you know, the USB-C port's not working with Rick's audio adapter anymore. Well, that's a terrible thing. So anyway, that's the long and short of it. I think it's good, but I don't think you need it. I think you can pass on this one, wait for the 0350, the 0400. And that's all I really had for today. So if you've got any experience that I missed on this, because we've tested it extensively, drop those in the comments below. Or if you have questions, drop those down there as well, and we'll get back to you as quickly as we can. I love testing stuff like this. And again, we tripped over it because we're developing a couple of new products for the channel that I think you're gonna love. And this one was really frustrating because I was all ready to launch this product, and now I've got this hobbled USB-C port on it. So that's just my 2 cents on it. So thanks again for watching, and until next time, happy flying.